There's a tool in Lightroom that is super easy to learn and incredibly powerful. You can use this tool to upgrade the mood and atmosphere of your photos and even give them your own personal style. I'm talking, of course, about the color grading tool. And in this video, I'll give you a breakdown of how the tool works. I'll color grade 3 different images, and I'll even show you how you can give one photo 3 different looks using only the color grading tool. So I think that by the end of this video, you'll be using the color grading tool like a pro and making better edits of your photos. So there's a few different ways that you can color grade or add color to an image in Lightroom. You could, for example, use the white balance, you can use the tone curve, you can use the HSL sliders, and you can use the calibration tool. But the color grading tool is unique in its way that it affects the tonal range of an image. And that means the range from dark to light or from shadows to highlights. So the color grading tool actually adds color to the different areas of luminance in an image. And this can be very powerful to give an image a certain look or a certain feel. Color grading is generally added when you are finished with an edit. So basically when you're happy with your edit, but you want to add that little bit of extra, that final touch and that distinctive personal style to an image. That's where color grading comes in. So I've made this black to white gradient to make it very clear of what every dial in the color grading tool does. Because like I said, the color grading tool adds color to different areas of luminance in an image. So if we open the color grading tool in Lightroom, we can see these 3 controls here. And these are what are called the color wheels. And there's one for the shadows, which are the darker parts of an image, one for the highlights, which are the brightest parts of an image, and one for the midtones, which are basically in between the brightest and the darkest parts of an image. And on the top here, we have a few different options. So the first one is the 3-way color grading, which is the screen we're in now. So the shadows, highlights, and midtones combined. And then the next one will take us to the color grading of the shadows. Next to that is the color grading of the midtones, and then the color grading of the highlights. And this last one here are the global color grading settings, which I'll talk a bit more about later on. So if I click on the first circle here, Lightroom will take me into the separate color grading settings of the shadows. So here I have finer control of my color grading specifically for the shadows. And on the top you can see the color wheel, and just below that the hue slider, the saturation slider, and the luminance slider. Now if you can't see the hue and the saturation slider, just click on this little triangle on the right here and they should appear. So if I select a color on the color wheel, you can see that this color is being added to the darkest areas of the image. And you can also see that the hue slider and the saturation slider have moved. So hue is the specific color on the color chart, and it's referred to by a number that you can see appear at the end of the slider here. And saturation refers to the intensity of that color. So the further to the right the slider is, or the higher the number at the end of the slider, the more intense or the more saturated that color becomes. So you can see if I move the slider across here, the color in the shadows becomes more intense. And I can also move the hue slider to change the color, or even put in a number here if I have a specific color in mind. And the luminance slider determines the brightness of that color. So if I move the slider over to the right, you can see that that color becomes more bright. If I move it towards the left, you can see the color becomes more dark. So it's essentially brightening or darkening those shadows. And if I click on the next circle here, Lightroom will take me to the color grade settings of the midtones. And again, if I click on a color in the color wheel here, it will get added to the midtones of this image. You can see that the hue and the saturation slider have moved and are referring to the color that has been selected here in the color wheel. So as I move this selection in the color wheel, you can also see that these sliders are moving. Basically, the circle goes from red to yellow to green to blue and to magenta and back to red, just as you can see on the hue slider here. And the saturation goes from desaturated all the way to 100% saturation, just as you can see on the color wheel. So the inside of the color wheel is desaturated, the outside of the color wheel is at 100% saturation. And then I can click on the next circle and Lightroom will take me to the color grading settings of the highlights. And again, I can select a color on the color wheel here, and you can see that this color appears in the brightest parts of the image. Okay, so I haven't talked about these last two sliders here, the blending slider and the balance slider. So these two sliders actually affect your total color grade. So your shadows, midtones, and highlights combined. So the blending slider determines how these colors blend into each other. So if I move the slider towards the right, you can see that the transition becomes a lot smoother. And if I move the slider towards the left, you can see the transition becomes a lot more harsh. The balance slider sets the dominance of a certain color in the image. So if I move the slider over to the right, you can see that the colors of the highlights become much more dominant. If I move it towards the left, you can see that the colors of the shadows become more dominant. And lastly, we have the global color grade settings, and they apply one color to the entire tonal range of a photo, basically making everything that one color. And it's good to note that the global color grade settings overlay all the other color grade settings in the color grading tool. So it's something you want to add maybe at the very end of an edit when you want to cool down or warm up an image, but you want to do it more subtly than, for example, with the white balance. Okay, so now that we know how the tool works, it's time to put it into action. So for this first photo, I actually want to cool down the photo a little bit, but more specifically, I want to cool down the mist in the background because I don't want to lose these warm autumn colors in the tree. And the color grading tool is perfect for doing that because I can select the color grading of the highlights and add a blue color specifically to the highlights. And then I'll add some saturation to that as well and just move the blending slider over a little bit just to make that blue color come out more. And then I would like to add a bit of those warm colors, those autumn colors to the midtones and the shadows just to bring those colors out a little bit more in the tree. So I'm going into the color grading of the midtones and selecting a warmer color on the hue slider. So something yellow, orangey, and then adding a bit of saturation. And then also in the shadows, I'm choosing a warmer color, maybe something more towards the yellows, and adding a bit of saturation. And I might darken the colors in the shadows here just to create a little bit more contrast. So I think that this looks pretty good, but I do find that the warm tones are a little bit too dominant in the image. So I'm just going to move the balance slider over to the right a bit to bring back those cool tones of the highlights. Okay, so let's have a look at the before and after of this photo. So if I turn the color grading tool off, you can see what we started out with. And then if I turn the color grading tool back on, you can see that this color grade has added a lot of mood to this photo by basically cooling down the highlights and bringing back a little bit of that warmth in the autumn colors of the tree. So for this next photo, I actually want to create a bit more color contrast between the buildings in the shade and then these parts of the image that are being lit up by the sun. So you can tell that this image overall has the same tone, the same color. It's pretty warm and there's not that much contrast. So what I'm going to do is add some blue in the shadows here, add some saturation, and also move the blending over a little bit. And as you can tell, just by adding those blues, it's already created a lot more contrast. So I'm just gonna turn off the color grading here and turn it back on. And you can see that that's introduced a lot more contrast in the photo and even made those brighter parts pop. So basically what I've done, I've introduced complementary colors in the photo, and complementary colors are colors that are opposite of each other on the color wheel. So you can see on the color wheel here, we have blue on one side and then the orangey yellow tones on the other side. So in the image, the blues in the shadows and the orangey yellows here in the highlights. Those are complementary colors and they tend to create more contrast and in combination are very pleasing towards the eye. So what I'm gonna do next to really finish this color grade is add some warm colors to the highlights. Because you can see the highlights are the parts of the image that are being lit up by the sun, and I want to emphasize that. So I'm just selecting a warmer color on the color wheel here, adding some saturation, and you can see that that really brings out that glow, that warmth of the setting sun. So if we just have a quick look at the before and after, you can tell that before our color grade, this definitely wasn't a bad image, but by adding this color grade, it's just introduced a lot more contrast and it's just added a lot more atmosphere into this photo. Okay, so for this last photo, I want to show you just how powerful this color grading tool is. So I'm going to color grade the same photo 3 times, and you're going to see we can create 3 completely different images only using the color grading tool. So for this first color grade, I'm going to try and create a more moody and cool image. So I'm going to start by adding some blues to the highlights, add some saturation, and I'm going to move the blending slider all the way to the right because I find that this usually gives me the best result. And then I want to counter those blue tones in the highlights by adding some warmer tones in the shadows. So I'm just selecting a warm color here, adding some saturation. And like I said, I want to get a moody, cold image, like a cool image. So I'm just going to move the balance slider over to the highlights a little bit, just to bring back those cool tones in the highlights. Something like that. And I think I might add some more saturation to those highlights, just to make it, you know, very obvious. Okay, that's our first color grade. Let's move on to the next one. So I'm just starting with the same base image again. So there's no color grade on this image yet. And for this one, let's do the opposite. Let's try and create a more warmer color grade. So I'm just gonna add some warm tones to the highlights here. Add some saturation. And again, move the blending slider all the way to 100. And then I'm gonna again create complementary colors, create contrast by adding a cooler tone to the shadows. Add some saturation. Something like that. Maybe just a bit more saturation to those highlights, because we have a lot of highlights in this photo. Okay, that looks pretty good. Let's try our third color grade. So again, I'm starting with a uncolor graded photo, and let's try something different here. I'm just gonna add some magentas to the highlights. So somewhere maybe more towards the reds, and then add some saturation. Just move the blending over a little bit more again. And then I'm gonna keep working with complementary colors because that usually just works well. So I'm gonna add something more towards the greens into the shadows. So somewhere around here, and then add some saturation as well. And then I might add some blue colors into the midtones, somewhere around here. Not too much. And then I'll maybe add a bit more saturation to the highlights and move the balance over just a bit more towards the highlights. And actually, I'm gonna bring down the luminance of the midtones a little bit just for some extra contrast. Okay, I think that looks pretty good, and as you can tell, that really didn't take me very long to create 3 different color grades of one image. Of course, generally, if you are color grading and if you're working on a final edit, you'll spend a bit more time than what I just did, but I just wanted to show you that how quickly you can completely change the look of an image just using this very simple tool. So I hope that through this video I was able to teach you a bit more about the color grading tool and that you can use it to make better edits of your photos. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!